So, we are returning to the middle of Moonrise's call. A little bit longer than the last half, but... Cheers, Hatsune Mug. Okay, so, Chapter 4. We just, last time we took off, Funk just, unceremoniously said goodbye to the Velns in their, the Bilgewater, which is kind of their cafe/bar area on the barges. So now, Chapter 4. Got a text that came through, of course. Okay. There was only one place the orphan army would gather if told to do so by their king, and Oss sped through the waters to that location with growing dread. If the family stepped outside the Bilgewater now, there would be no more questions as to the truth of Gigas Veln's prediction, Oss mused. That truth was undeniably written across the horizon for all to see. The twin moontide was coming, and the ominous proof of its approach shadowed Oss' journey the entire way. The Nixian sun rose too slowly to compete, its glowing lavender face still hidden behind the dark wall of water. The two lunar harbingers of the coming destruction, however, were visible at last, peeking above the aqueous mark of their passing like jewels on a dark crown. The silver orb of Tethys and its golden partner Erithus rose almost side by side, driving the rolling crest of wave and death unwaveringly before them towards the fragile, insignificant flotsam of the barges. Gev did his job well, for when Ost arrived at the central barge of the Orphan Kingdom, he found everyone gathered and waiting. Part of him was relieved to see them all there, ready for him to lead, believing in him to protect them. But another part of him was terrified by it. He was Ost the Orphan King, because he guided the orphans and worked every day to make their lives better. For the most part, he was successful against the many struggles, but he'd never faced anything like this. He didn't even know where to begin. The only thing driving him forward, despite all the uncertainty, was the stark and brutal reality that if he didn't help them, no one else would. Funk caught up to Oss just as he neared his destination. The dredge eel was much smaller now, barely longer than Oss' lower arm and no wider than his wrist. The small, only slightly murky creature didn't speak or even gurgle as he coiled around Oss' right forearm to rest in his favorite spot after the recent expenditure. Oss couldn't help but grin at the return. It wasn't the first time one of Funk's dredge blasts came in handy, and he was reasonably sure it wouldn't be the last. He may be exhausted by now, but after a short downtime, the funky little eel was guaranteed to give Oss a foul, yet exuberant play-by-play of the atrocity. The orphans gathered upon the grandest floating barge of the Orphan Kingdom. It was a cast-off home from one of the family quarters, but no one ever claimed it when found. So, Oss claimed it for his orphans. It didn't have much of a roof. The walls were sturdy, though. Even better still, the platform was built from the highest quality corkwood. The velociraptor you heard in the background is my cockatoo Jimmy. It was one of the few parts of the Orphan Kingdom which stood thoroughly enough above the water that their feet could stay dry no matter where they tread. This was an unthinkable luxury for the orphans, and they welcomed it with an exuberance which saddened Ost a little, for they had such small hopes and dreams. Of course, something so fancy couldn't be for the orphans alone, they argued. Despite his objections, they dubbed it the Orphan King's throne room in honor of him. But in reality, it was just a place they liked to gather and listen to Ost tell stories or teach them new games. Oh. Ost wished he only had a nice story to tell them today, but he brought nothing good with him. Instead, he was about to ask them to abandon everything he helped them to achieve over the past few years. The current barge they were on was strong and sturdy. It was lashed together well and would likely hold up together better than any other piece of the Orphan Kingdom. Brody blocking. He's decided that he heard me talking about him being good, so he's not going to be good. It was also large enough to hold everyone. All of those points mattered for what Ost intended, for although this raft was sturdy and durable, it would never survive the coming wall of water. If it remained lashed to everything else, they had to untie from the barges. But to do that, they were going to have to cut loose all of their homes and all of the places they worked hard to claim for themselves in their Orphan King. It was the only way he knew to save them, but he knew it might destroy them in the process. Ost was about to adjust his buoyancy to launch onto the platform when he felt the entire sea surge violently against itself. The current of the Skrasa Beltway slowed, stopped, and then suddenly surged backward. Ost was only just able to grasp one of the corkwood beams of the raft in time to keep from being sucked away with the rush of water. He'd never felt anything like it in his life. His muscled body fought the raging torrent while his mind battled a fury of straining forces within. The world was entirely off kilter, and it was growing difficult for him to tell up from down. Then almost as quickly as it began, it was over. The water was gone, and Ost was slammed down hard and left standing confused and sore upon solid ground. It was the most frightening thing Ost had ever seen. The sea was gone, for as far as he could see in every direction but one, the water world of Nyx had gone dry, and the floor of the ocean was revealed to the sky above. The orphans, young and old, began crying and wailing in fear. They, too, were horrified by the strangeness of dry land. Hold on. The animals decide to act up as soon as... It was the most frightening thing Ost had ever seen. The sea was gone for as far as he could see in every direction but one. The water world of Nyx had gone dry, and the floor of the ocean was revealed to the sky above. The orphans, young and old, began crying and wailing in fear. They, too, were horrified by the strangeness of dry land. But what terrified Ost even more was the realization that all of that water was going to return soon, and with reinforcements. It was going to be extremely bad. Ost leaped up onto the now landlocked platform of the raft and began to call to others. Cut the tie ropes, unlash them, do whatever you have to. Get us loose from the rest of the kingdom before the water returns. The orphans were shaken from their frightened stupor and began running around, untethering their life raft from the burden of the orphan kingdom without a word of protest for what they were losing. Although many of their teary-eyed eyes revealed the damage done, others, catching on to the coming danger, started lashing down the supplies that Ost told them to bring. It wasn't certain whether any of it would help, but Ost's guidance had gotten them this far alive. They were willing to continue the gamble on those odds alone. The raging force of the twin moon's draw sent tremors through the exposed ground. The world of Nyx had but a shallow crust between the outer oceans and the deep, dense nether sea within its core. They remained separate through a delicate balance, but the combined power of the two moons was more than that balance could bear any longer. In this spot, along the Sagrasa Beltway, the crust was thinner, weaker. It couldn't stand against the draw of the moons without the water to shield it. The earth split in a growing rift of cracks and fractures across the sea bottom, the metal-flecked sand collapsing inwards as the solid stone beneath gave way. Surely, the entire ocean would be consumed, Ost thought in horror as he bore witness to the unfolding and deepening disaster, but instead of the sea draining into the violently widening canyon, the waters of a much darker sea plumed upwards from the fissures, in great black geysers, surging free to join with the growing swell of the twin moontide. Ost and the orphans could only stare in stunned and trembling awe. The water returned less violently than Ost initially anticipated, but that minor reprieve didn't diminish the danger they still faced, for the true threat was evolving right before their eyes, and hadn't ceased in its ominous roaring approach. When the first ripple of the tide came, it was darkened not just by the clouded taint of the nether sea seeping from below, but by the black shadow of the rising wall not far behind it. Yet that wall showed one distinct imperfection. "Dark tide!" a man's voice screamed in dire warning. "Flee!" He appeared like a bead of quicksilver, dancing with a mystifyingly agile grace across the surface of the devouring plume. Violent turbidity roiled beneath him, yet his pace and fluidity never wavered. He outraced the wall of the blackening moontide, gliding across the water's surface using only the bottoms of his feet. It was as if he'd grown so buoyant that he simply ceased sinking, like a corkwood tree, and could now skate freely on top. It seemed an impossible feat to Ost, although he'd never actually tried to increase his buoyancy that high before. Whoever this one man was, he proved it could be done, and Ost found himself promising if he survived this day he would give it a try. "What is a dark tide?" one of the younger girls whimpered behind him, but Ost had never heard of such a thing and couldn't answer. Although from the looks of what was coming, even if Ost did, he likely wouldn't have felt right telling someone so young the truth about it. "It'll be okay," Ost assured everyone, though he fought to keep the quiver of fear out of his voice. Ost felt confident the man was a guardian of the tide, for surely this must be the way such champions appeared. He was like a vision out of a Reapweiser tale. The moonglow cast by Tethys and Erithus shared a violet tinge for smothered traces of the sun. This combined illumination from three heavenly bodies cast the new arrival in a fantastical display. Their light refracted upon the rivulets of the sea's surface, painting the man's nearly bare frame with a shimmer. His skin and hair exhibited a natural metallic platinum sheen, so the rippling cascade of reflected light played across the twisted cording of his muscles and flesh with a likeness of opalescent scales. He glided effortlessly through the maze of platforms and ramps before coming to a skidding halt upon the sea surface directly before Ost and the orphans on their barge. "Where are the adults?" the man asked in a soft melodic tone. "Who's responsible for you?" His words were rushed. It was clear there were many other things he needed to be doing, and rescuing children wasn't the most immediate. But he was honorable enough to place them high in his priorities, despite the growing need he appeared to feel. "Ha!" Adults responsible, Ross snipped. Even standing before a champion, he felt little urge to hold back his clever tongue in angry adolescence. They're so responsible they left us here and ran away. Orphans, then, the silver-skinned man considered. Surely they're adults in this village. Where are they? Seeing to their own. They see to them, we see to us, Ost bragged a bit. Bragged a bit, though he was beginning to tremble from the sight of the coming moontide and the almost overwhelming pull of the moons upon his body and mind. So who? If you're looking for a responsible party, an adult here, you'll quickly find the two don't meet in the same person. If you're just looking for who leads things right here, that's me. Ost pointed his chest with his thumb in a cocky gesture. Funk gurgled assent, then hissed at the newcomer. And who are you, young muck-tamer? The guardian asked. It was close enough to the slanderous title he received from the families that it triggered Ost-ingrained defensiveness even more. He's the Orphan King, Gav defiantly announced before Ost could even get the next rude comment off his tongue. Who are you? I am Rin, last of the line of Arkan Knights. Ark Rin Wave Dancer, commander of the Tethys Wave Guard. He still stood upon the water, his feet bobbing on the roiling tide as the barges slowly lifted into the moon swell. A little late, Ost quipped as he nodded towards the mountain of water behind Ark Rin. The title guard smiled queerly, mildly amused by such brash humor in the face of these dire circumstances. Then he peered closer at the boy, a bit more intrusively than Ost liked. Ost felt every inch of his muscled body being assessed and judged with a bold, unashamed stare. Then the silver man smiled much more broadly. You feel it, don't you? Ark Rin asked. It was the second time someone suggested that today. And they were right. But how did they know? The moons, you feel the draw of them both. The title guard pushed harder. He looked to Ost, waiting for an answer. When none was forthcoming, he tried to urge him on once more. Orphan King, is it? Ost, he corrected. His natural distrust of adults stood in his way, but something about the man's bright, assuring eyes soothed those worries. Ost the Orphan King? I suspect they gave you this name as you don't use it yourself. Ost could only nod. That speaks highly of you. You wish to protect them, correct? Ost nodded again. Then I need you to listen to me. We have to get them out of here. There are worse things in a dark tide than the water. What's happening? Ost demanded, hoping for the world to make sense once more. The moons, together they are too strong. You feel it. They've breached the seal upon the nether sea. The pull of the moontide is drawing up things that lurk in the darkest depths of the center of our world. You must get these children out of here now. The beasts from the nether sea always hunger, and always strongest when pulled to the surface. What do I do? Ost pleaded. He was always self-reliant, but for the first time in his life he didn't know how to respond, and the cost of doing nothing was too high for him to resort to the usual escapism when matters got too rough. He soothed his pride by telling himself it hurt nothing to ask. Ark Rin nodded as if seeing the inner struggle within the older boy, and commending his courage. You're obviously title-born, but you have other natural talents too. I can see the metals in you. They don't gather this densely in someone so young unless they have gifts. Gold and iron in your skin, bronze and copper in your hair, and there. It always shows in the eyes first. The title guard leaned in to peer into Ost's eyes. As I suspected, there's almost no platinum along the Sagrasa Beltway. But the truly gifted can pick up some anyway, and there it is, the platinum streaking in your eyes. Strong lineage, boy. So what all can you do? Wait, the metal lets me do things? Ost was confused. He just thought different people took up the various metals into their skin and some didn't. No, the metal is more of a side effect, a consequence of using gifts. If you can affect forces, doing so often results in a faster attraction and absorption of the metals into the skin. You're clearly used a force of some strength regularly, or you wouldn't have taken up so many metals. So what can you do? I can make myself float or sink, Ost blurted, without thinking first. Before the Guardian's suggestion, he hadn't considered his buoyancy trick unusual. It never occurred to him that not everybody could do it. He regretted the words the moment they left his lips. Either everyone could do it, and he sounded like a complete spongehead, or it was a gift that he just gave something of himself away to the stranger. Ost was just thankful he stopped, rambling before revealing anything about his earlier abnormal experience. The two moons were urging him so powerfully into the sky right then that he was fortunate it wasn't the very first thing he mentioned. Honestly, he couldn't think of a sane way to explain, or he might have. That uncertainty compounded with his instinctual distrust, and Ost decided it would be better not to reveal more. Good enough. Anything else? Ost shook his head no. Ark Rin stared for a moment as if suspecting it was not all there was to this boy, and then seemed to dismiss it. He was satisfied with Ost's capabilities, and that seemed enough. You need to unhook this barge and pull it free from the rest of the village. Ark Rin Wave Dancer peered up at the looming wall of water. It was almost upon them, but moving at a tortuously slow pace. The barges had come loose from its anchor lines, and the entire floating village was being drawn into the swirling currents of the moon-born mountain of water, pulling them ever skyward towards the frothing peak of the moontide's crest. You are fortunate, young Orphan King. The two moons are causing some drag upon each other. Their orbits have slowed. This wave is moving much slower than the normal moontide, and the most turbulent part of the current appears to be higher up the crest. If you hurry, you might be able to get your subjects away from the worst of it. Will you help? Ost asked, once more doing the unthinkable and asking for something of someone else, but he had only one thought. He must save the children. I wish that I could, but I must search the tide for creatures from the deep. They're more dangerous than any wave. Take care, Ost, and hurry. I will return to make sure all is well if I can. With that, the platinum-skinned Arkan knight skated off across the churning waters effortlessly and up the crusting behemoth wave of darkness. Arkren vanished up the wall of water quickly, leaving Ost to figure out how to save his or orphans alone. The children had managed to detach the barge from the surrounding village while he was distracted by the stranger, but they were still trapped in the center of the lashed platforms. Oh my goodness, my nose is driving me crazy. Already the damage, it doesn't itch until I start reading, and then it's just like, haha. Already the damage from impacts as their newly freed raft shifted loose was beginning to show on the fine corkwood frame's edges. If Ost didn't open a path free from the rest of the village, their sanctuary would be battered to pieces. And while most of the children were likely strong enough swimmers to get themselves to safety if the need rose, there was one among them who couldn't. Gev would never be able to jump into the sea and swim away from the raft. He would never be able to overcome his fear of the ocean to leave the barge. So, Ost had no choice but to find a way to free it from destruction. Everyone into the house, Ost called to the orphans. It barely had a roof, but it had walls that could protect them from being washed overboard by a surging wave. He had work to do, and he couldn't do it well without knowing the children were okay. So he ushered them into the old rundown home and got them all seated before heading out. The barges was a quarter of the way up the wall of water by the time Ost set out. The currents of this bizarre twin moontide swirled in confusing, erratic vortices and figure eights, and such a spot had captured the floating village. The delay might last a minute or an hour, there was no way to tell, but Ost fully planned to use the time he had to free them before they climbed high enough up the wall to be torn apart by the raging crest wall. It took a titanic effort for him to turn his back from the leering lunar eyes of Tethys and Erithus, nearly above him now. He felt as if his skin was about to be pulled off his body and sucked into the sky to clothe the moons in his golden tan hide, but he pushed on, fighting the drag of their unrelenting call. Ost increased his buoyancy as high as he could go and leaped off the end of the barge in an attempt to mimic Arkren's feat. He began to sink almost immediately, but managed to propel himself across the surface in a stuttered, sinking hop. Each step drove him down practically to his waist before the reverse force of his buoyancy pushed him back up and out of the water. It was awkward, but it worked. Oh, this chair is uncomfortable. Oop. Stool. From the platform to rampway to waves, Ost worked his way through the Orphan Kingdom with a bobbing, splashing pace, untethering the surrounding sections to open a channel so the barge full of orphans could float free. He worked quickly, and was soon nearing the edge of the kingdom and the few remaining lashings holding the escape route closed. But Ost failed to anticipate the way the village would react when the last thread holding the old realm together came undone. The Orphan Kingdom split open like the gaping maw of an abyss clam. The force of the separation was so powerful, it began a chain reaction of snapped lashings and broken boards throughout the floating village. Ost was thrown into the water and carried away from the crumbling remnants of the barges. Swirling blackness enveloped and blinded him as he was dragged down into the dark tide. He tried to fight against it, but the Orphan King's throne room vanished from view, banishing any hope of finding his way back. Hi, Alexa. Welcome back. Okay, Chapter 5. For a few frantic moments, Ost was deprived of all control as the churning currents thrashed him about within the turbulent body of the moontide. Darkness enfolded him until he could no longer see to discern up from down. The roar of the raging waters overwhelmed the reliable song of the sea, negating the last sense capable of finding an escape. Amidst that blind thrashing state, Ost felt other things swimming among the black water with him. There were serpentine bodies twining and slithering past his legs and scaly armored forms which bumped more violently, scratching his skin with their jagged hides. Ost expected to feel the piercing agony of teeth at any moment, but the beasts didn't attack or harm him purposely in any way. He could sense something that was building among them, though. It was like a school of predacious fish closing in on prey. They never dive in immediately for an all-out assault. They circle, driving themselves into a frenzy of senses before the biting are started. Ost only hoped he could escape before the bumping and grinding excited them to that point. The numerous overwhelming threats left Ost paralyzed with fear and uncertainty. He was lost and surrounded by monsters with no idea which direction he should swim in to find the surface. But an insistent tugging at his right arm brought him back from the brink. When all seemed hopeless, Ost's most faithful sidekick was there, as usual, to lend a squishing tail. The slimy grip of Funk pulled continually in what was likely the correct route of escape from the moontide. Ost knew enough to trust Funk and his sense of direction to dredge eels displayed an impressive talent for seeing through dark, hazy clouds, a trait that was understandably convenient for their kind. What Oss didn't trust was the ability to follow the meager tugging of the greatly diminished eel while so many other monumental disruptions were spinning him to and fro. It was going to take more than just adept swimming, so Oss drove his buoyancy up, trusting the natural thrust of the water to expel him. Usually when Oss strained to such levels, he could shoot upward swift as a coral dart, but the surging currents around him were too much to overcome. He fought desperately against the chaos and swirling debris of the dark tide's turbid heart, but the exertion began burning through his air too quickly. Oss grudgingly gave up the struggle to conserve his energy and come up with a different plan. But as hard as he tried, he couldn't conceive of anything that could compete with the raging force of so much water. Only the moons held such power. The realization was as terrifying as it was hopeful. There was one force stronger than anything Oss had ever experienced, stronger even than the smothering wave holding him prisoner. It was a force he'd been resisting all morning. Its strength even now threatened to overwhelm him when he needed his wits the most. But his wits, and the forces Oss usually relied on, were failing him. His only hope of escaping the moontide was this strange alien compulsion. He hated the thought of giving in to it, but he knew his only chance of survival lay in submitting to the pull of Tethys and Erithus for the second time that day. Waves and currents were no match for the power of the twin moons, for they were forces driven by the moons themselves. They had no choice but to obey the call of Moonrise. It was their nature. Oss was only just beginning to accept that it might also be in his nature as he submitted to the summons of Tethys and Erithus, like the sea, like the waves. He was title-born, and as such, there was no other choice for him but to obey. Oss was high up within the body of the moontide by then, nearly centered between the twin moons. There was no longer a single unified summons beckoning him skyward, but two mighty forces competing over his insignificant form, tugging in opposite directions. The strength of their dueling clutches wrenched painfully at his joints and muscles as he submitted to them at last. Tethys drew him right while Erithus drew him left, but in their struggle they only succeeded in pulling Oss upwards through the swell. He burst from the churning frothy crest at a surge and came to a halt, floating suspended at the very peak of the roaring mountain of water. He breathed deeply of his newfound freedom, but that freedom was its own trap. The two moons held Oss' body blocked between them, bound where the equal yet opposing forces converged. He hovered several hands above the surface of the sea, just above the dip where the clashing moons dampened the rise of the moontide. In his desperation to escape the dark waters, Oss submitted utterly to the moon summons, but now that he'd given himself over, he couldn't rescind it, for it held his mind as tightly as his body. There was no thought of escape, only the encompassing melody of the tide's harbingers. The dual call of Tethys and Erithus formed a rhythmic thrumming in Oss' mind, akin to the song of the sea he knew so well. Its harmony resonated throughout his entire body until he felt it begin to emanate from within him as well. The moon sang to the sea, bidding it to rise. With Oss now part of the symphony, the waters responded similarly to the call. Like before, Oss felt the moon's pull begin to shift, no longer drawing him higher. Instead, the force was redirected beneath him until the surface of the sea pursued him like a tide of his own. The slight dip in the wall of water vanished, filled by a rise in the ocean's surface from Oss' bizarre new feat. But it was a trick he had almost nothing to do with performing, let alone the ability to escape from. Oss' salvation appeared in the streak of gleaming silver darting across the scape of dark water and shadowed crest. It rose with astonishing grace to collide with him, enfold him, and drag him back to the sea's surface. The secure grip of hardened muscles and smooth, firm skin pressed against him suddenly, overcoming the compulsion of the moons. He could feel their pull still, but it was relinquishing a bit of its greatest hold as he was carried away from the crest of the moontide. In Oss' clouded mental state, it seemed as if a platinum shard from Tethys had descended from the sky to lead him to safety. The lunar rescuer embraced his barely conscious form tenderly as it glided down the rolling face of the moontide. "Are you insane, boy?" Arkrin's fluid voice intruded on the humming song of the Moonrise's call. "Tide surging at a moment like this. Impressive, I'll admit, but stupid. The beasts from the nether sea are drawn to the moon's call. You might as well ring a dinner bell for them." The guardian's voice paused. The swaying swish of his feet across the surface and the roaring blare of the tide walls groan were all Oss could hear for a few moments. "Or do you not even know it yet?" The last part seemed spoken to himself. "The children, are they okay?" Oss managed to utter as he awakened from the lunar trance. "They appear to be safe for now," Arkrin answered. "The force of the town's destruction pushed your little barge full of orphans free, and it looks as if a few of the older ones have steered them into one of the descending currents. Smart, that. But you need to get them further away from the rift in the ocean floor. The beasts will begin to hunt soon. The moon's call will wane, and the call of hunger will grow." "Let me go, then." "Set your float first," Arkrin cautioned. He slowed to a near halt to give the boy a chance. Oss didn't even realize he'd lost control over his buoyancy during the moon trance. Arkrin's gift alone was the only thing keeping them from being sucked back down into the raging core of the moontide. Had the tidal guard let him down as requested, Oss could have been lost to the depths of the wave once more. As it was, their clasped bodies were being tossed around hectically as they descended through the chaos, near the tide wall's crest. Oss shifted himself to float to reduce the burden of his drag. Immediately he felt the pull of Arkrin's stronger gift raise them more fully onto the churning water surface. His feet sank lower into the surge than the tidal guards, but he was rather impressed with how far he'd come, since learning the trick was even possible. Arkrin gave him a bit of support at first, and a few directions in following the surface currents of a moontide. Before long, they were both rushing as they cascaded down the side of the roaring mountain of water, skating to and fro with downward building momentum. As the tidal guard warned, hunger at last won out over the call of the twin moons. Like the shifting of ancient continental plates, a deep groan of bloodlust and gluttony resounded from the beasts in the dark tide. It drowned out the song of the sea and the moons with a new song, the song of the hunt. The monstrous creatures from the depths of the nether sea had woken from their moon trances as well, and they were ravenous. "Your subjects need your services, young wave-runner," Arkrin called across the already widening gap between them. He pointed towards the descending barge near the base of the moontide. The shadows beneath the waves were no longer compelled to remain within the tide's peak nearest the moons. There was food to be had, and such a prize was enough to draw the beasts towards the outskirts of the wall of water, to where the orphans even now believed they were escaping the worst of it. "What about you?" Ost called as he hastened the stuttering skipping bob of his pace. "The entire world needs my services these days, it would appear, Orphan King." The guardian of the tide slowed as he neared the apparent target of his diversion from Ost. An enormous black shape, nearly twice the size of the other, slid swiftly through the moontide wall not far beneath him. Something so massive could surely swallow the orphan's barge whole. With a flip of his wrists, a pair of sleek metallic fin-shaped blades opened along the outer edges of Arkrin's forearms. They protruded not from his arms, but a pair of bracers so finely crafted they blended perfectly with his platinum flesh. Oss hadn't noticed them until now, or the nearly identical pair which opened along the tidal guard's calves either. Armed with his exotic weaponry, Arkrin nodded encouragingly back to Oss before vanishing into the moontide to hunt the hunters. Oss had little time to contemplate the surrealness of his encounter with the guardian. The shadowy forms beneath the waves were closing on the orphan's life raft, and he was still too far up the tide wall to do anything to stop them. Oss attempted to dance upon the waves as Arkrin did, but he couldn't sustain his buoyancy high enough. The added propulsion of trying to glide across the surface kept disrupting his float, so all he could manage was a clumsy bobbing hop. Swimming would have been faster, but Oss couldn't allow himself to sink back into the wave for fear he would never emerge again. So he pushed on. Progress was painfully slow, and the imagined horrors that might befall the orphans made the pace even more torturous. There had to be a faster way. Once again, Oss saw only one solution. It held the same dangers as before, but this time he hoped his experience with the moon's calm made him a bit more prepared. It was a bit like the spine coral venom. It drew him compulsively back to it time and again, but with enough resolve. He believed he could control himself. He could take just enough and no more without being consumed by it. Oss understood the dangers, and doubted Arkrin would be there to save him if it went wrong, but the Orphan King owed it to his subjects to give his all. Besides, if they died, what good would it do for him to survive if he had to bear the guilt of that failure? If he had any hope of reaching the barge in time, he would have to court the Song of the Twin Moons once more, and use its pull to dance upon the tide. He couldn't pinpoint how exactly he managed to do it in the end. He was already charging forward with every ounce of strength and concentration when he attempted it, so the action was done more out of instinct than any practiced or controlled approach. Ost opened himself up to the draw of the moon song. Only he didn't submit completely. He allowed a fraction of the tugging force in, just enough to lift him the last few inches he needed to skate across the surface of the tide. Any extra bit was dispersed beneath him in mimicry of the moon's own emanations. The surface of the water bulged upwards in a tidal surge beneath him from even that small emission. He couldn't really control it. He barely understood how he managed it, but the adrenaline of his fear for the orphans drove him to unimagined feats, and he didn't have time to pause to consider what exactly it was he was doing. Oss drew from the forces of the water and the moons to go faster, harder, and stronger. He gave everything he could to save his charges. He danced across the waves, perhaps not as gracefully as Arkrin, but he managed to leave the bobbing attempt behind in his desperation. His feet slid in gliding strokes down the vast swaths of the moontide with each powerful stride. Even with his renewed speed, however, Oss knew he couldn't arrive in time. Several dark shapes were already circling and the floating sanctuary, and another had emerged from the sea with a target in its sights. Oss nearly lost his focus and crashed back into the waves when he spotted Gev standing at the edge of the barge, staring transfixed into the approaching wall of water. He was likely trying to count it, to diminish his fear of it in some way, but it was going to get him killed. A black serpentine shape was closing in on the boy, sliding its way up the broken wall behind the child to fall on its unsuspecting prey from above. Following Oss' current path down the face of the moontide, the barge was too far away to reach the boy before the creature did. However, the angle he was approaching from put him almost directly above the raft. If he could leap far enough out past the curving wall of the wave, he believed he could drop straight to the barge below. Ost utilized his instincts once again, and opened himself even further to the moon's summons. It flooded his mind, trying to consume him, but he redirected that force beneath him into the water at his feet. The surface rose like a small competing tide, bulging out from the side of the larger wave, lifting Ost a bit further towards his target. Then he leaped forward from his perch with every ounce of strength, and plunged down the roiling face of the moontide towards the raft below. There was a game Ost often played with the children, where he attempted to wash them from the barge by making a big splash. It was an admittedly immature antic, but it was the only thing he could think of to save Gev now. Ost positioned his plummeting body to maximize the splash, then decreased his buoyancy to full sink. When he collided with the surface of the water, he wanted to hit like a rock. He knew it would traumatize Gev, but it had to be done. Ost struck the water near the edge of the raft with a concussive force. A torrential wave rippled out from his point of contact and caught Gev's frail frame up in the roiling surge. It was practically a minor tsunami, and it did its work well. Gev was yelling the number 3 in frantic succession when the sudden splash struck and washed him clean off the raft. The swell carried the boy beyond the monster's reach just as it was making its move. Gev completely melted down, as Ost expected. He was in the sea, the one thing he couldn't counter grasp. The boy's mind and words devolved into absolute terror. Ost felt an upwelling of guilt, but reminded himself it was better than being food for that eel thing. The creature wasn't so easily thwarted, however, and Ost saw it racing up the side of the barge in pursuit of its lost prey before he sank completely beneath the waves. The beast was fast, but it was smart too. Its intelligence allowed it to perceive Ost as a threat, so despite the evident hunger which drove it, the slithering foe turned its attention to the surface of the water at the raft's edge. Ost was sinking rapidly away from the danger, even as the threatening black head leered down at him. The small barge had been steered back to the shallow seabed across the beltway, so it wasn't very far to descend. As his feet struck bottom, he reached down and stirred through the sand for the familiar feeling of an abandoned auger shell. They were everywhere along the beltway, so the search only lasted moments. Ost's hand curled into the convenient shape of the shell's opening until it fit his fist virtually like a glove. Then he kicked back towards the surface with a powerful thrust. Ost increased his buoyancy to its new peak. The surge of his kicking feet combined with the water's push drove him upwards with astounding force. He held the solid spiked auger shell out above his head like a weapon as he sped towards the unsuspecting foe. The beast only saw it coming a moment before he struck, but its momentary flinch wasn't enough to save it. Ost exploded from the water directly beneath the creature's indistinct head and impaled its toothy, gaping maw upon the spiked back of the auger shell. Ost felt the incredible impact all the way up to his shoulder, but was completely caught off guard by the assault's effectiveness. The eel-like shape was obliterated by the force of the strike. Its body erupted, raining upon the surrounding waters in a shower of oily darkness, then vanished. The creature appeared to have no solid body at all, not even the sludgy muck of a dredge eel, but a rapidly dissipating liquid blackness. The whole thing was intriguing to Ost, but there was no time to consider the matter further. Gev was screaming in terror and gasping so frantically he was choking down buckets of seawater. If Ost didn't do something soon, the boy would drown. Without even thinking about how to set the forces, Ost skated across the water to where the small boy was flailing to no avail, and lifted him from the turning sea. As he returned Gev to what he thought was the relative safety of the raft, he heard the boy's chant return. 2, 2, 2. Gev gasped the number between choking sobs. Sudden realization chilled Ost. Gev wasn't counting the waves or the sea. He said 3 because that was the number of what he saw. And now that Ost had killed one of the beasts, the boy's count had changed. Gev was counting the creatures, and there were 2 more of them nearby. The realization came too late for Ost. Before he could even respond to Gev's warning, he was overcome with the burning agony of piercing teeth as they bit into his leg. Chapter 6. The sensation was like being bit by a mouthful of spine coral darts. As the teeth punctured his flesh, Ost felt the familiar burn of fiery venom surging into his lower leg. His heart raced frantically as if it would pound through his chest. His mind spun as his vision dimmed and muscles slackened. Ost was confident that it was over, that he only had moments left before the venom destroyed his vital organs. His only despair was that he failed to lead the orphans to safety. But as the last traces of lavender morning light faded from Ost's vision, his mind expanded its senses beyond, and the world reappeared to him in a kaleidoscope of whirling shadows and electrical charges. It was the high of a coral darter, but multiplied 100 times over. Ost knew these sensations and understood what they meant. Even if the high dosage of venom was going to kill him, he felt confident he could use the moments he had left to save Gev. Gev's presence appeared erratic in his drugged state. The boy was a stuttering ball of arcing energy, an immense electrical force, but with an incomplete circuit. It was the first time Ost had looked at Gev under these sorts of effects, and he was quite startled by the differences. Ost could sense the other children's more grounded electrical sparks around the barge and inside the house. He could even detect some of the massive beasts which swam through the moontide, sparking brilliantly against the backdrop of the smaller creatures, but the 2 remaining threats he searched for didn't appear the same as the other life forms, and it took a moment for him to identify their distinct signatures. The serpent creatures had living sparks, but they were dim and smothered by a black emptiness. It devoured the light of their sparks within and all around them, making it difficult at first to discern them with the rest of the darkness. But once Ost managed, he found it was relatively easy to pinpoint where they were. In fact, he could sense more of them out within the moontide, but the pair he was concerned with were close. Ost spun with the Argrith shell still gripped in his hand and slammed it down on the shadowy presence he detected behind him, where it still gnawed at his leg. The emptiness exploded upon contact, and for a moment the creature's inner spark shined through. Then it flickered and died, vanishing into the surrounding darkness like the rest of it. The third creature was closing in, but Ost hurled his spiked weapon and saw the satisfying burst of shadows upon contact. He searched frantically but found no other shadowy sparks nearby. Ost had managed to banish them just in time, because the beneficial effects of the venom were beginning to wear off. His strange vision dimmed, and the pain of his leg came crashing down. He collapsed to the barge planking, exhausted and overcome. Ost could sense the sea turning more turbulent, even as he lay there, half-conscious. Something was wrong. The current in which the children directed the barge should have had them nearly free from the moontide by now. Something must have changed, but Ost no longer had the energy to even open his eyes to find out what that was. "He lives?" The melodious voice reached Ost, even down in his exhaustion. "He's Ost!" he heard Geb counter, forcefully, as if that said it all. "Indeed. Another oddity about this boy. Most would have died quickly, unless..." A moment of silence passed. "You're a coral darter, aren't you?" Arkrin's voice suddenly intruded closer upon Ost's absent mind. "Others may scold, but quite honestly, it saved your life. If that bite had been your first exposure, your heart would have exploded." The world shook violently. Ost tried to open his eyes to see what was afoot, but as the venom drained out of him, all the energy seemed to go with it. "Damn it! The moons are splitting. There's no escaping down that way now. We're gonna have to ride the crest." Arkrin was clearly distressed. "Boy, Wave Runner." His voice grew louder, closer. "I know how you likely feel right now, but I need your help if you want these children to live. I can't do this alone." Ost tried to respond. He turned his head a bit and groaned, but could manage little else. "I would normally not dare something like this to someone so inexperienced, but it's the only way." Arkrin seemed to be convincing himself more than the comatose boy. "I need you to swallow something. It will make you feel better. For a little bit. Although I guarantee you're going to feel even worse than this after." Something touched Ost's lips, and he felt a dribble of liquid fill his mouth. "Swallow as quickly as you can, or you won't get it down." It took more effort than an act such as that should ever take, but Ost was able to gulp it down before the fiery rage began. When it hit his stomach, it spread through him with a fiery fury of spine coral venom, but the ferocity was slightly subdued from the injected method. It was smoother, less violent. The electrical senses returned, although they were a bit dimmer, less intrusive on his awareness. The only thing the same was the euphoria and the surge of energy. The pain in his leg vanished, and Ost stirred to life. "A lot nicer than stabbing yourself with coral, isn't it?" Arkrin offered. "What some call drugs, others have refined into curatives. It'll carry on over a longer duration than injecting, but not that long. Not after the large dose you just received from that eel bite. If we're going to do this, we'll have to be quick." "Will my vision come back, or do I have to do it all through this weird sense? Open your eyes, boy. It's a lot easier when taken this way. You can transition between the two." It didn't seem like it would be possible. Ost had taken spine coral venom more times than he could count, and never once was he able to see through his eyes. He was utterly convinced it was impossible, but as he did as instructed, the world appeared normal before him. He gave a startled gasp. Ost closed his eyes and the electric sense returned. When he opened them, the world was there again. It was quite astonishing, and if Arkrin didn't pull him from his little experiment, he likely would have kept testing until it all wore off. "The moons are separating from each other. The currents of the moontide are changing. We can't escape from this side any longer. Everything, including this raft, is going to be dragged straight into the widening split between them, no matter what we do." "Then what?" Ost asked. His mind was surprisingly clearer than under the usual drug haze, and his words didn't slur with exhaustion. "If we can ride the barge straight down the center channel, we should be able to clear up and over without hitting the worst of the turbulence. But," Ost followed up, he knew it couldn't be that simple. "But we're going to need something to anchor the barge to the center of the tide so it doesn't get ripped aside by one of the alternate currents." "You mean someone, don't you?" "Yes, Wave Runner." The Guardian nodded regretfully. "And I can't do it alone. I'm a wave dancer. I can skate across the water as light as a corkwood tree, but my skill at sinking, as you call it, is weak. The tidal surge would tear me from the center channel, and the barge would follow. I need you to help us sink so we can keep it steady." "But the creatures..." "You take us down, Wave Runner, and I'll make sure nothing touches you." "Do I really have a choice?" Ost replied. "Not if your heart is as honorable as I believe, young Orphan King. Ost looked around at the gathered faces of his subjects. His decision was already made. He just wanted to lock them into his mind to spur him on. As he dove into the darkness, their memory would help him push deeper and further no matter what he faced. They tied themselves to the barge by a long rope, then gave the older kids instructions on how to steer into the correct current and maintain control once they entered the worst of the Tidewall's rapids. As the Orphan King's throne room narrowed in on the center channel, Ost drew in a deep breath in preparation for the plunge. "Hold on to me," Arkrin instructed. "We're tethered so we won't lose each other if you lose hold, but we'll drop faster if we stay close. Otherwise my drag will cause issues. Now sink more than you've ever sunk before." They took hold of each other then, guarded in the tide and Orphan King, and plunged into the surging darkness of the moontide. The water felt colder than Ost ever remembered, the Nixian sea feeling before, likely the tank to the nether sea's depths, but it was more than the water that chilled Ost as they sank into the black abyss. He had a new form of vision in this time, and the darkness no longer hid the reality of the beast within, which lurked all around them. The creatures from the deep were immense and more numerous than Ost first imagined. He couldn't make out the exact shape of their bodies, but he could sense their awesome presence and the surging strength of their electrical energy. Not all their life sparks shimmered as brightly, however. There were beings cloaked in emptiness and shadow mixed in among them, and the two types appeared to battle each other within the churning moontide. Shadow spread, more sparks dimmed, and still Ost and the Guardian sank deeper. At first the creatures took little notice of them. Most things that sank in such a fashion are rarely worth eating. But though their motion disguised them, they could not hide their sense. The more sensitive beasts slowly began to hone in, and Ost could see the frenzied dancing of their sparks as they closed upon their prey. They were plummeting down through the black heart of the moontide. The only thing keeping them from being tossed around by the currents was Ost's sinking ability. Arkrin assisted, but the difference was notable. The tidal guard was not his equal in this skill. When the rope at last went taut, they were moving at such a steady pace it practically ripped Ost's legs from its socket. Thankfully, he was temporarily immunized from pain. He felt the pull of the barge tug back as it fought the treacherous currents on the surface. It was working. But doing so left Ost and the Guardians dangling at the end of a line like bait, and the fish were coming. Though they remained bound by a long tether, Arkrin detached from his embrace and slid into the currents with a grace among the swirling madness that mystified Ost. He couldn't see the Guardian's silver body within the murk, but his life spark danced with a mesmerizing litheness in that other awareness. It was evident Arkrin's agility at wave dancing spanned above as well as below. Ost was only just discovering how diverse people's life sparks appeared in contrast to the small glimmers of ocean light he was familiar with. Everyone seemed distinct in their own way, but it was evident almost immediately that there was something special about Arkrin's. The Guardian's energy remained calm and measured, practically grounded in his surroundings. It was as if he was connected in some way to the world around him through his spark. Ost couldn't help but wonder what strange gifts that might hint at, although the earliest glimmers of that answer were revealed as the first predatory sparks surrounded them. One by one the massive thunderheads closed upon them in the darkness, and one by one the dancing lightning of the Arcan Knight severed their spark and flashed away to meet another threat. Some he extinguished completely. Some he simply turned away after a flurry of attacks, but Arkrin Wave Dancer kept his promise. Nothing touched Ost as he anchored the barge. Ost could feel the pull from the rope and sense the orphan's position. They were almost directly above him now, likely just clearing the dip in the crest wall. The turbulence was growing fierce, and Ost was forcing his sink ability further than he ever attempted. His entire body felt compacted and cramped. His bones ached with the extreme change in his density, but still he drove further to hold his charges steady as they cleared the peak. The anchor line jerked violently, yanking Ost backward and slightly off course. The fury on the tide's surface had grown too intense. As it tossed the barge, it spun Ost's dangling body through the abyss below, despite having forced his sink skill to its limits. He needed more, and now. Ost strained his mind, willing his body deeper, but there was nothing left for him to give. The only place his body wasn't compacted to sink completely was his lungs, and they had held all of his air for the dive. But air was extremely buoyant. How much deeper could he push without it? Ost knew if he expelled it there was no way he could return to the surface, but at the very least he could get the orphans clear of the moontide. The memory of their faces before the dive filled his thoughts and granted him the courage to do what was needed. He wished them all well, then exhaled violently as he focused his mind on sinking deeper and faster than he ever risked in the past. It felt as if every molecule of air was being purged from his body in that act, like wringing out a sponge, and once complete, Ost felt himself sink like never before. The lashing of the anchor line ceased as his downward force pulled the slack taut. The surging currents on the surface fought him, but Ost held on, even as he felt the awareness darkening along the edges from lack of air. The Orphan King gave everything of himself to that fight, and if he had any air to do so, he would have cheered as he felt the barge slip over the peak of the moontide, and into the slightly calmer waters on the far side. But the change in tension shifted as the orphan's raft began its ascent. It was more than the already It was more than the already stressed rope could take. It snapped with a jolt. With nothing holding him back, Osh plunged into the dark depths. He tried to reverse the buoyancy and shift afloat, but the invigorating effects of the venom that kept him going were fading fast. His thoughts were slowing, and he could barely move his limbs. Osh searched for the guardian of the tide, hoping salvation might be near, but the dancing spark of the wave dancer was too busy fighting being dragged down with him. There was a fierce tug as Ark Rin tried to stop them both, but even the guardian's gift of floating couldn't counter Osh's downward force. A second, smaller jolt signaled the end of his hope, as the tether was cut purposely. Osh didn't blame him. He would have dragged them both down if he hadn't. The last hint of venom vanished, taking the lightning bolt image of the wave dancer from view along with the enhanced awareness. Osh's pain returned, and exhaustion overwhelmed him at last. Not long after, the lack of air reached his threshold, and he slipped into unconsciousness. The last thing Osh felt as the world disappeared was the cold black waters of the deep enfolding him. He wouldn't even drown in the surface seas, he realized dismally. He was falling through the fissure to die alone in the dark nether sea below. Chapter 7. Osh woke to the bright lavender rays of the Nixian sun upon his face and the rough firmness of corkwood planking beneath him. A foul odor assailed his nostrils, likely the offense that woke him from his state. It took only a moment to recognize the familiar overpowering stench of a dredgeel. Funk? Osh asked. His vision was blurred by the bright sun and a splitting headache, but he could tell he wasn't alone. He felt the firm squeeze of his reeking companion around his upper arm. "And Gev," an excited voice squealed. Osh felt the young boy's arms wrap around him, and he fought the urge to wince. Everything hurt, and the touch bordered on agony, but he didn't want Gev to know that. "Hi, Gev. Glad you're okay." He managed to make his voice sound steady. "All of them are, young wave runner. Because of you." Our grin was close. "But how am I okay?" Osh asked. "I lost consciousness. I fell into the abyss. I must say I thought you were lost. I tried to hold on to you, but—" His eyes dropped for just a moment. "Something from the deep carried you out upon its back. I suspected you landed on it as it rose to the moon's call. I didn't get a good look in the darkness, but its life spark was immense." "A Leviathan!" Gav offered exuberantly. "A Leviathan saved Osh." The orphans began muttering excitedly with a story that was certain to grow. "Perhaps, young one." Ark Rin gave the small boy an encouraging smile and tousled his colorless hair. Then he turned his attention back to Osh. "However, there are other large creatures of the nether sea. I doubt this beast did it purposely. Whatever the motive, I found you on the precipice of the new rift, where you must have fallen off. By then your sink had weakened, and I was able to carry you to the barge. Leviathan or not, I believe you were rewarded for your sacrifice. You were willing to give your life to save these children, and almost did. They wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. I think you may have had a hand in that, title guard. You came back for us. If you hadn't, I would have been useless to them. We all would have died. I saw you were in danger. It is a guardian's duty to help." The man was so noble about it. It annoyed Osh a bit, but at the same time intrigued him. Ark Rin served something higher. Osh always thought the only thing higher than his existence was to be family-born. That prospect certainly never appealed to him, but this was something altogether new. The guardian of the tide served out of duty and honor, and those sentiments were mostly unknown to Osh until now. They whispered of things he always felt in his heart to be true, however. After seeing those traits in someone else, he began to better understand the drive behind many of his actions over the years. "I thought the entire world needed you. You were part of this world, too. Besides, I watched you today. The world of Nyx may need you as well, Ost Wave Runner." "Tide Commander," a woman's voice intruded. "Hooray, you survived." Ark Rin rose to greet the new arrival. "Barely," a bassy male voice joined in. "We're all that's left of the Tethys Guard. The entire Erithus Guard was lost defending the village. The beast smelled all the people gathered. It was almost a feeding frenzy. If it wasn't for the Gigas Maelstrom, I heard the legends about her, but—" "Did anyone survive?" Ost interrupted as he found the energy to sit up. The Velns and the rest of the pretentious families of the barges were always mean to him. He wasn't sure why it mattered so much, but part of him was genuinely concerned for them nevertheless. It was that strange, honorable part he seemed to share with Ark Rin. "Ah, sorry, kid. I'm making it sound worse than it was. There were only 2 Erithus guards left after the last dark tide, and they weren't riding the highest waves, if you know what I mean. Their loss will be felt, but they were better suited to guarding a rift crossing than a moontide. But don't you worry, Gigas Veln is equal to a squadron by herself. I doubt anyone on the barges was injured too badly." Despite his personal grudges, that news brought relief, and as Ost looked around at all the families' faces of the orphans, he felt the tension the familiar faces of the orphans, he felt the tension he was carrying begin to lessen just a bit. He didn't completely comprehend how he was still alive, but just knowing everyone else made it through was enough for now. The sea was settling at last. The Orphan King's throne room managed to hold together, and everyone was safe. It was the first time since dawn Ost didn't feel a sense of impending doom. Without that burden weighing on his mind, he began to look at the Guardians of the Tide not as potential saviors amidst disaster, but as the mythical heroes of legend that the stories claim them to be. Ost had already experienced the swift and agile skill of the wave dancer. He couldn't help but wonder at what properties these other two guardians possessed. "So what can they do?" he asked with little tact. "Ha! Blunt kid," the male guard replied. "I guess introductions are in order, since it appears our Tide Commander has taken an interest. Vesper Wavecrasher of the Tethys Tide Guard." Vesper was a brood of a man, heavily muscled and thick-framed. He had a gruff appearance that was only enhanced by his strange skin markings and sharp, flinty eyes. Nixians naturally take up metals and minerals as pigments throughout their life, but until now Ost had only witnessed this pigmentation dispersed uniformly. Vesper's flesh was marbled in strange patterned streaks of silvery gray and black. It reminded Ost a bit of the banded threshers who camouflage themselves among the sagrasa grasses with their dark striping. Ost had no clue what gift the name Wavecrusher might hint at, but Arkrin sensed Ost's confusion and spoke up. "Vesper could very likely outsink you, young Wave Runner, although he can't float to save his life. After today, he's all that remains of my command's assault force." His voice broke with a hint of emotion at the last comment. "Drist was old," Vesper interrupted. "He went down the way he would have wanted, Tide Commander. He fought those black demons, killing dozens, even as they dragged him into the abyss." The two men seemed to forget everyone else at that moment. "And Kella? And Gil?" Arkrin's voice seemed pained. "How could we have known about those black things back then?" Vesper counted. "It was the first time anyone saw one. If we'd been prepared—" "We knew about the black thing this time, Vesper. We still lost Drist and what was left of the Erithus Tidal Guard, because we didn't know the moons could travel together or breach the Nether Sea. This is the first dark moontide not formed over a natural rift. No one could have known that either. What else don't we know? How much worse will it get? How many more will die?" "I'm sorry, Tide Commander. It's okay. You were only honoring him the way he would wish to be honored, but damn him in dying honorably. If I could drag him back to help me fight what's to come so that he could die old and dishonorably in his bed, I'd do it." "Do you really think it'll get worse, Commander?" "Honestly, Vesper, don't you?" Ost couldn't help but be a bit shocked by the sound of Arkrin's word. He was a valiant warrior, a fact proven this day, though he sounded defeated. He wouldn't stop fighting, for he was still the brave warrior, but his tone held a finality to it, as if he was preparing to race into battle one last time with little expectation of triumph. "Boys," the woman's sonorous voice cut in, "there are other less grown-up children present. It might be nice if you two didn't terrify them with your speculation and ill-timed eulogies." She was tall like Vesper, but much slimmer, and she shared the same peculiar markings, only she was more silver than black, and she had a splash of gold streaking which gave her an orangish shimmer across her torso, and gold-flecked hair. It was clear, even though Arkrin was Tide Commander, this woman commanded some authority among the two men, even if it was a personal authority devoid of actual rank. "Apologies, Ray," Vesper offered, but Arkrin was already staring off a bit worriedly at the two now separated departing moontides. "Let me introduce myself, children. I'm Rayatha Seasinger of the Tethys Tidal Guard. I prefer everyone just call me Ray." She bobbed on the water surface at the edge of the barge, clearly talented in wave dancing like Arkrin, but it was the sea singing which Ost and the orphans were most familiar with. Everyone knew about sea singers. They were spoken about in almost every old reef-wiser's tale in the legends of ancient Nyx, but in the present day they were more known for their utility. While only the wealthiest of Nixians could afford such services, it was still an honorable and well-known gift. Sea singers could meld the voices of their song into the harmony of the sea and send messages through the currents to almost anywhere, as long as there was someone who could speak the song of the sea at the destination. "I'm Ost." He found the strength to stand at last, though he fought collapse at every moment. The lady bobbed her head in traditional welcome and gave a warm maternal smile. "Ost," she crooned as if testing the feel of his name in her song. She glanced back at her commander, who was gazing directly across the horizon, then back. "I suspect he has given you a name, young Ost? He wouldn't be here still with those," she pointed off at the distant moontides, "if he didn't see some value in you beyond saving your life." "Wave Runner," he replied. "That is high praise indeed, Ost, Wave Runner. Do you hear this, Vesper? Boss is recruiting again. Boy looks like he don't need no recruiting. He's a bit banged up, but I bet he'd fight that tide just bare hands if it turned around and came back." "It can't do that, can it?" Ost asked with growing concern. "Don't be minding me, boy," Vesper replied. "I tend to say the wrong things trying to be funny. They can't turn around. The moons go in straight lines for the most part. They may go off course a little more often lately, but never heard one turn around." Oz felt a bit of relief, but Arkrin spoke unexpectedly, and the grave concern in his voice remedied that diminished tension immediately. Tethys won't turn. It's speeding up now that it's free of Aerith's pull, and it's heading straight for the Greater Rift Crossing at Hovestand. Orders, Commander. Vesper switched to immediate attention at the sense of dread in his leader's words. I need you to wake right Aerithus and see if it turns. Steer clear until the dark water dissipates. Just watch. If it sticks to the current course, there should be nothing but deep sea. I'll send for a new unit to meet up with you around from the Titus breach. When the new commander arrives, you can return to the Tethys command. Are you sure, Commander? If the darkness remains and the moontide hits Hovestand, you'll need Vesper for the fight. I can chase Aerithus, Ray offered. It was clear that though both deferred to Arkrin's authority, he was open to the words of his subordinates. I'm not going for a fight, Ray. I plan to race Tethys and do our duty as guardians of the tide. I'm going to warn the people of Hovestand and evacuate the crossing. We can't fight this, and when the moontide reaches the rift, if there is a sea singer at the crossing, I can reach them with a message. The resonance is all off, with both moons so near and too close to the rift. I want you to try, but I understand all too well the disturbance along a break in the crust. I'm a better sea singer than most. I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about the person who has to strain to hear your beautiful voice through the chaos of a rift break. Doesn't matter, Arkrin suddenly broke off. Your number one priority is to contact Moonspire and get them to send out reinforcements to all the tide commands. And find out where the third moon Mathis is. If these things are going to start joining up, I think we should begin tracking them so we can predict when and where it might happen. Yes, Commander, I'll go immediately. Waves protect you, Vesper. Waves protect you, Tide Commander. And welcome to the family, young Ost Wave Runner. Ray spun with a delicate swirl and began to sing. The waves in front shivered, then grew more ordered, as if carrying the rhythm of her song. The ripples spread out in a path before her, and she danced across their aqueous crests. Always the show-off, Vesper muttered. Well, Commander, unless you have other orders, I should probably start chasing a moontide. Arkrin nodded, and the striped brute sank beneath the waves. What did she mean by welcome to the family? Ost interjected. He'd remained silent throughout the exchange, watching the bizarre interaction between them. They worked together so smoothly, but it was more than work. They genuinely appeared to care for each other. Their bond was unlike the families who stayed together because of blood, and it was nothing like his own responsibility towards the orphans, because it was quite clear that any of these guardians could hold their own alone. Yet their bond appeared equally strong without those motivators. It intrigued Ost, and he found he wanted to know more about the workings of the Guardians of the Tide and the story behind Arkrin and his companions. You're our family, Ost. Gev grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the title guard and back towards the other orphans. It was a startling reminder of his own duties and responsibilities. He felt a momentary stab of shame for thinking of a life beyond these children who relied so entirely on him. Arkrin assessed the situation, gauging the mood of Ost and the orphans around him. It was clear there were things he wanted to say, but the fear of Gev's stubborn face silenced most. I have never known a sea singer who didn't make some prescient claim at least twice a day. Although I rarely discount Riatha's words, she has been right in about many things. Could I be? Ost stammered. He was stuck dreaming of something more while being bound by his own personal sense of duty. He had to know if it was possible, even though he could feel the trembling terror of the small hand holding his own, reminding him it didn't matter. A title guard? Arkrin clarified. You have gifts, boy. More than most. On that level, you more than excel, but gifts aren't all that make a guard. We forswear homes. We live in the path of the moons, riding the tides until we retire or until we die. Few ever retire. The Tide Commander paused and looked toward the moontide of Tethys on the distant horizon with growing concern. As he turned back, Arkrin glanced down at Geb with a hint of sympathy, then stepped towards Ost. He stared intently into Ost's eyes, analyzing something left unspoken. Ost felt confident Arkrin was going to ask for his help, or at least to join his command. His heart was ripping to shreds in its effort to decide what to say if it happened. He knew he couldn't give the answer he wanted, but still desperately wanted to be asked. He needed to know there was something more than this life out there for him, even if he never actually ventured out there. Arkrin, strain growing across his silvered brow, appeared about to ask just that, but something he saw in his assessment of Ost shook him before the words left his lips. The words he ended up saying were likely not what either expected. You picked a bit of my platinum. There are a few new streaks at your temples, even more in your eyes. That's a fast intake. I imagine you will find you have a wide range of talents that haven't even been tapped yet. I would be interested to see your lineage. If it helps, I think my mother was a wave dancer. The memory came back so suddenly it nearly brought tears to Ost's eyes. His answer, should he be asked, became suddenly certain. Why do you say that? I remember her dancing across the waves as she left me at the barges. I wonder how free she floated without me to burden her. Ost glanced down at Geb as guilt swelled up within him. That would be all Geb would see if Ost left, the person he counted on most abandoning him. He couldn't do that to any of them. There was no one else who could or would take over. Archer Wave Dancer appeared to sense the stir of emotions and the inevitable outcome should he ask. He saw the difficulty Oz was having with his conflicting desires. Whether the Guardian of the Tide needed recruits or not, the children needed their orphan king, and that realization changed everything he meant to say. I must thank you for your help today, Oz, the Orphan King. The title given was purposeful, and Oz caught the hint immediately. But I must go alone from here. This is a darkness even I don't know if we can vanquish. I can't take an untrained boy into the depths of a dark moontide. Again. And certainly not when it's barreling towards a rift into the nether sea. Besides, you have your charges to look after. Oz understood he could only say no if asked. Yet he was torn. Part of him was obligated to stay, and he was relieved he didn't have to voice his answer, but another part of him felt dismayed. He hadn't even been asked. He needed to know. So I'm not right for the Guardians of the Tide? What about Ray's comment? Fear not, Wave Runner. The tide calls you. There's no denying that. If it doesn't return for you, you'll seek it out in time. Arkrin turned and looked at the children on the barge. You stay now out of a duty to protect them, and that's honorable. It makes your heart a worthy fit for the Tidal Guard. It means you're willing to make sacrifices of yourself to protect others. You may discover in time, however, that you can protect them better out there than you ever could by staying here. Something is coming. I can feel the seas above and below stirring. Grow strong, Ost. If this twin moontide isn't just an anomaly, but a new pattern, we may need everybody we can find to join in the fight in the days to come. I will. I promise. It was the first time Ost had ever sworn anything to anyone but himself. He'd of course made pledges to protect the orphans and such, but those vows were always made within the silence of his own mind, because the only person Ost trusted to deserve such a pact was himself. But Arkrin was different than anyone he ever met. He chose to help Ost and the orphans when everyone else had written them off as below consideration. He came back when he didn't have to. Those were facts Ost couldn't shake from his mind, so if Arkrin Wave Dancer asked him to prepare for a future need, he would hold that oath. He didn't know how exactly he'd prepare, but he fully intended to begin exploring the limits of his power to find out. With balance above and balance below, waves protect and the tides guide you, young Wave Runner. It was an archaic speech, but just barely familiar to Ost, though he hadn't a clue where it was from. As Arkrin spoke the words, he made several smooth motions in the air. I feel your spark, Wave Runner. I hear your song. Should I be close in a time of need and feel you, I will come. For Ray is correct in a fashion. We have faced the moontide of Tethys and Erithus together. We are tide-bound. I will hold true to that sacred bond. Farewell, and rule wisely, Orphan King. Ost watched the Tide Commander of the Tethys Moon Guard skate away across the waves as he watched his mother depart so long ago. Like then, Ost felt his heart yearn to go with. He didn't want to be left behind. He felt compelled to join in this fight and learn what more he could with these new strange gifts. Despite his longing for adventure, however, Ost couldn't imagine forcing Gev or any other orphans to watch him leave in the same way. They had no one but him, so as much as the moons and the waves called to him, he decided for now to put away his newly won title of Wave Runner. He would remember, but until the tides returned for him, he would set it aside for his older, more familiar title of Orphan King. Ost swore to follow the advice of the Tide Commander. He would grow strong and learn what he could of the abilities revealed today, for he could feel in the pull of the moons and the aqueous trill of the waves that the Guardian of the Tide was right. Something was coming. The world of Nyx, as a world of water so often does, was about to change, and Oz felt confident that the only people who would survive were those who were prepared when it did. Continue Oz's tale in Book 2 of Guardians of the Tide, Song of the Rising Deep. And that is my first full book reading. I've read full short stories, but Moonrise's Call. You can get Moonrise's Call still on Amazon. You can order, or actually you can order signed copies directly from my website, brandjalexander.com. They even come with a bookmark. Yeah, and if you want to continue the story, Song of the Rising Deep releases on Saturday, December 31st, New Year's Eve.